Welcome to Myco Minute, conversations about collaboration brought to you by the capacity creators at Myco Consulting LLC, where we help higher ed, nonprofit, and philanthropic leaders advance the initiatives they care about most.
Welcome back to Myco Minute. I'm your host, Deb Mashek, and today I'm joined by John MacIntosh, who is the managing partner at SeaChange. SeaChange is a firm that supports nonprofits as they navigate complex challenges. And today we're going to talk about one of the new initiatives that SeaChange is very much a part of, which is called the Transformational Partnerships Fund. So John, welcome, and tell us about the Transformational Partnerships Fund, what it's about, and what's transformational about it.
Right. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me. So as you'd mentioned, the firm that I run, which is itself a not-for-profit, its mission has been from the very beginning, 15 years ago, to try to find ways to help other not-for-profits work through complex financial and organizational challenges. And one challenge that we've been helping groups with since 2008 is how to, or I guess even more fundamentally, whether to, and if so, how to navigate the exploration of a merger, a deep joint venture, a back office sharing arrangement, sort of any sort of, let's call it transaction where independent organizations are combining some or perhaps all of what they would otherwise do together. And we do that work not because we think that these sorts of partnerships are always the answer. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but they're always hard because these sorts of discussions raise not only sort of financial, legal, what I'll call difficult but sort of technical questions, but also questions about mission and about emotion and psychology. And so what we have found over the years is that being a disinterested third party who at worst is a free confidential, offers a free confidential place to have discussions, but may also be a source of grant money, has proven useful. I used to say, when you mentioned the fund, I used to say we only work with real not-for-profits, no eds, no meds. And I can't believe I ever felt that way, but my only excuse is that as a Canadian who at the time didn't have any college-aged students, I really didn't understand what the landscape looks like. I didn't understand anything about the birth rate and technology, the political headwinds and challenges that higher education's faced, and I also didn't really understand that there are 5,000 institutions out there that come in a whole variety of sort of shapes and sizes, and that yes, probably helping Harvard explore a merger with the University of Michigan, I'm making this up, of course, is something that's well above the pay grade of SeaChange as a 7-person not-for-profit, but that there are a large number of schools, often smaller, but not always, that perhaps we can help. So we launched this fund about a month ago, really co-created with the ECMC Foundation and quickly joined by Ascendium and Kresge, so 3 of the more active funders in higher education. And our goal is very simple, which is to try to help students who would benefit the most from being at institutions that are as effective and efficient as they can be, and on the other side are at the most risk if the institutions that they are enrolled in falter, or in some cases even sort of fail. And those students, to us are BIPOC students, and they're students who come from low income backgrounds. So that's really, ultimately what this is all about. I guess for me,
and I just really quickly to jump in there, some of the stats on the website are that 12% of all students are at institutions that are at risk, and 19% of all Black students are at institutions that are at risk. So I'm curious, what does it mean for an institution to be at risk? And then also, you're saying,
so I think, let me just say that for me, when people say, how many colleges do you think are at risk and how many do you think are going to fail? My stock answer, if I'm feeling tired or passive aggressive, is do you think there's intelligent life in other galaxies? And people stop and they're sort of shocked by that response. And I say, listen, it's a coherent question, and it's, I guess, an interesting question, but it's totally irrelevant to your life. And I feel the same way, that there's a lot of in some cases, sort of mean-spirited discussions about how many schools are going to fail and what percentage of schools are going to fail. And that's not what this fund is about. The fund is not about changing the trajectory of higher ed broadly. It's about saying, if we roll up our sleeves and we make good choices with our time and our grants, can we look back and say, hand on heart, in at least a few instances, we were a good partner to institutions who were able, in part because of our involvement, or perhaps because of our involvement, to make more timely, wiser decisions that made a difference for their students. Like that's what it's about. But those statistics, there've been a number of books written, and I think that was Bob Zemsky's, I think I have that right, book, The College Stress Test, where they did some analysis of IPEDS data and regressions, and sort of concluded that there were a handful of institutions that were at some probability of failure in the next sort of 4 or 5 years. And then they looked at who were enrolled in these institutions. And, I think the numbers are shocking. I would say one other thing though. I think it's dangerous to get drawn into the only thing that matters is, institutional failure, not being able to continue. And related to that, the only reason to pursue a deep partnership is if the alternative is that you would fail. I mean, I think it's, I think it's certainly good to do that, but if you look at something like the Boston Consortium or the Claremont Colleges, it's not clear at all to me that if those 30 schools, I mean, let's take Harvard. Harvard is one of the 30 in the Boston Consortium. I'm really quite convinced that Harvard would be fine, even if it weren't in the Boston Consortium.
I suspect you're right. So then that gets to the question of what is meant by transformational in the name of this fund, because transformational doesn't mean, survival.
Right.
What does it mean?
Well, so I think transformational, to be clear, it's a dangerous word. It doesn't apply to the fund. It applies to the partnerships we hope to get involved with. And I think, sort of, it when you see it, that these are partnerships which, if successful, would make a material difference to the institution's ability to serve students. And so I know that buying pencils together isn't transformational, but maybe having CFOs come together into something like the Boston Consortium to do a range of things that includes pencil buying might be. I think a run-of-the-mill articulation agreement is probably not transformational, but a group of colleges coming together like they are in New Mexico, to try to say, how can we share a range of things, or a group of colleges in a rural area saying, listen, here's how many adults we think collectively we have as partial completers. Can we work together to identify those? So even if the legal form ends up being it's just a multi-party articulation agreement, I think you can step back and say, like, if that were successful, it would make a real difference to those students. And I think with our more established funds, where we've been at it 10, 12, 13 years, we have some pretty rough and ready litmus tests for what is sort of transformational. It's early days in higher education. My test used to be, if nobody's crying, it's probably not hard enough and potentially transformational enough to be appropriate for us. I think doing something that can make a real difference is hard, because you're doing something. The only person who's crying if you buy pencils together is the person who used to sell them to you at like too high a price. Right. But I think that, moving organizational boundaries, doing things in a different way, working through, FERPA, or those are hard things. So it's almost like transformation shows up as degree of difficulty. Even though obviously they're different concepts, I think they're often together.
So, I mean, what's coming up for me is perhaps transformational are those partnerships that, first of all, solve a real pain point, and not just in a like, gee, I wish we could save money but there's some barrier that's getting in the way of actually fulfilling the institutional missions, which are these very student-centered, serving the community, serving the regions, that sort of thing. And that this fund brings in the capacity necessary to at least explore options for that transformation.
Yeah, and
There's something, yeah, there's something there about, you keep mentioning the students, and yes, they're absolutely at the center, but often there are these practical process barriers or relational barriers that need to be overcome in order to fulfill those missions.
I'd say I would add two things, Deb. I think that when people say, and certainly in higher education particularly, there are some bright line legal tests. A merger means something different under federal law than a non-merger. But if you just sort of put those aside for a second, to me the most important question is like, what's the pain point? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What is it that we need and what is it that we offer? And if you need to reduce your back office costs because you're pretty small and it's killing you, or more likely you just don't have the scale to do certain kinds of things, but maybe with others you can, then obviously the answer perhaps is to explore sharing your back office. If the need is that you've got partial completers who live out, I think it's backwards to be too focused on what's the form of the partnership. That's sort of the cart before the horse. The question is more, what is it that we that we have and that we need and that we can do. That's the first thing I would say. I think the second thing I would say is I'm super lazy, or I'll rephrase that. SeaChange has 7 people, and the world is very big. And so I think when people call us to ask us to get involved in something, I think the default answer needs to be no, because someone else is most likely doing it. Let's identify that person and send you to them. Or if truly nobody's doing it, that's because it's impossible. And so either way, we have a great bias towards not expanding our activity. And so, over 15 years, there've been a handful of times where we've said, wow, somewhat surprising, I think we can add some value here. And I was very suspicious or concerned that in higher education, with so many smart folks in different ways, inside institutions, as consultants, and I think organized in a very helpful way by people like AGP and Nakubo and others, right? That was there really anything for us to do? And I think the answer is yes, because sometimes the possibility of grant money and the safe place can nudge. It's almost like I don't know. A lot of these discussions are like in a quantum state. It's kind of, we're not like, are we going to do this or are we not going to do this? And so sort of
a dance, yeah,
sort of saying, hey, like we might be able to support this, but you've been talking about this for a long time. Like, are you really serious about exploring it, or quite reasonably, is it not going to make the cut because you've got a lot of other stuff going on? Sort of forcing that sort of that situation to resolve itself one way or the other, I think is one helpful thing that the fund can do. And then the second thing is, the great tragedy here is when people spend, I don't know, I'm making this up, but illustratively, 18 months to explore something that they decide not to pursue for reasons they should have known or could have known in the first month. And that's certainly true for something like a merger, but it could also be true for a co-curricular back office sharing, doing sports together, whatever. And there's a lot of psychology that makes it sort of seductive to delay the tough issues till the end, or to not speak sort of openly and honestly. And our strong view is, as part of the process of thinking about whether a grant would be helpful, let's try to make sure that we understand with the institutions what are the sort of issues here, and let's see if we can hit, if we can, the big one early, so that you have less risk. So that even if you're only 2 months into an 18-month process, you've de-risked the discussion. Now, obviously in higher ed, that's complicated by the communication challenges and shared governance and all that stuff. But if the issue is not about what the real estate's worth, it's about whether these Franciscans will get along with these Jesuits. Let's see if we can figure out a way to do that. If the issue is what is the real estate worth, let's work on that, because we really want to. I don't think that partnering is always the right answer, and I think it's not at all a failure when you explore something which you conclude not to do. It's often actually far from failure. It's a way that you learn something about yourself. But it's certainly a failure if you spend 18 months exploring something that doesn't happen for reasons you could have known early, because often, particularly if you're in any sort of fragile state, that time and money and emotional turmoil can leave you in a position where your degrees of freedom are gone, and you have less capacity to sort of make wise choice. And that's
Right.
really what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, those minutes, those resources, you're not going to get them back, and thus you'll be significantly depleted perhaps to engage in some of the other work that you could have been doing. So
Right.
talk me through how the experience works. So how do people actually engage the fund? What happens once they reach out to you? What's the mechanism?
Again, I think although this builds on work we've done for 13 years, although we've looked at 1,300 transactions and we've made 250 grants, blah, blah, blah. It's new and a little different, but I think the principles remain the same, which is pick up the phone and call. We used to say pick up the phone and call. I think we've now said, if you want to pick up the phone and call, that's great. But this little sort of advanced survey questionnaire inquiry thing would sort of be helpful. Okay. So we have on our website, we have a form, and you can choose. You can be applying for a very specific situation. Organization A and B are interested in exploring this, and this form is being filled out by organization A and B, and here's kind of what we're trying to do. Or you can be a little bit more general than that, and then we take a look at those and try to get back to people shortly, to learn more. If it's clearly not going to be a fit, let people know sort of immediately. If it might be a fit, get on the phone. Our diligence process, one of the questions that you have to ask is, why do the funders need you? Which is
that is one of my questions on here.
Why would right, and in most cases, they don't. We have at SeaChange, we have set up and run 6 funder collaboratives, different legal structures. 4 are grant making, 2 are lending, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about, what is it that makes the funders able to do things with us that they couldn't do on their own? Why are we adding value rather than being another mouth to feed? And I think part of it is that foundations are structured to make very large grants on a somewhat calendarized basis with due and appropriate consideration at the board level. But that's not a great way to approach this activity, because the grants don't need to be as large, but sometimes they need to be fast. If the moment is now, okay, I'm the leader here, I'm the CFO who really wants to do this, I've got some space on my desk because we're sort of kind of through COVID. If we're going to do this, we need to do it now. You can't hear, we'll put you on the docket for the October board meeting and we'll get back to you
in 6 months.
Right. And so part of it is to try to provide access to grants potentially on sort of, I don't want to say user friendly, but on a sort of faster, more reactive sort of transactional basis. And so again, I think the experience has been, give us a call, but it would be better if you filled the form in first. Let's have a conversation. And if we're off to the races, it's over a period of weeks or sometimes months, be in dialogue. A lot of these, as you would know, a lot of these issues are around psychology. So we often ask to speak directly to the people who ultimately will need to decide, which is often, but not always, the president, and or a couple of trustees. And then let's really work on what is the process by which you will begin to explore this thing. And we have come to believe, which I think is not countercultural in higher ed, but it is probably less common than not, that early on there's a great benefit in bringing in a jointly retained outside person. Not always. I mean, if the issue is what's the real estate worth, then you hire a real estate valuer. But often, whether you call them a consultant, a mediator, a transaction jockey, a project manager, just someone who wakes up in the morning to try to progress the discussions and who views their principal role as project management and encouraging clear communication so that the parties can explore their common interests rather than defend their separate interests. There's certainly a time where you need to understand and defend your separate interests, but I think it's framing it as a joint exploration is really very helpful, and there's nothing that makes that realer than jointly retaining an outside person to help. And again, we have no dog in the fight. We're not connected to you or anybody else who might play that role. We think it's vitally important that the institutions think hard about what they need and then identify the person who can best do it. And I think, again, higher ed is fortunate because there's a lot of talented folks with different life experiences who've put their hat into the ring. And they're relatively easy to find compared with my experience outside of higher ed, where you're talking about, 1.2 million organizations of working in all sorts of sectors. I mean, higher ed is a little bit more of a finite, really small pool, quite frankly.
So a couple follow-ups on that. Another thing that I think is really important about how you set this up is the role of confidentiality, that people can reach out to you or institutions can reach out to you. And that's not going to be broadcast on your website or on their website, that they can work with you to retain this outside person that kind of holds the container for the co-exploration of possibilities. So I'd like you to speak to the how you think about confidentiality, but also you're putting together this bevy of these third-party people who can come in and be resources. So how do people get involved in that?
Okay. Yeah. So look, I think confidentiality is no big deal in that it just is a natural follow-on from what I think is job number one for us, which is do no harm. And I mean, right. I mean, I think it's the simple fact is that I don't want anyone to be able to say, I wish I hadn't reached out to the Transformational Partnerships Fund.
That would be horrible. Yeah, let's don't do that.
Right. Or if it's like, oh, I mean, God, that was a waste of an hour. That guy didn't know anything. Like, I'm happy with like low level harm, but that's not even harm. And we want to particularly, we think we can be the fund can be the most helpful in the very early stages of discussions. And so I think if you're going to do no harm and you want people to feel comfortable reaching out early, you have to promise them confidentiality. And I think to some degree being outside of higher ed is helpful in maintaining that. How do we think about it? We have a group of advisors on the fund. We're really privileged to have been able to work with them. We've thought hard about what we do and don't share with them and where they will or won't recuse themselves. And there's confidentiality involved in our agreements with them. So I think part of it is like, how do you actually think about the process? We're not sharing information with our funders unless and until we're making a grant recommendation. Because in this fund, we do much of the work and the recommendations, but the funders ultimately choose. And although in theory there's a mechanism, I think in most cases, for them to consider a grant, you sort of have to name names, but that would still only be with the full explicit understanding of the institutions and when the time is right. Because usually confidentiality, the issue is not, is it okay for people to know? It's which people and when, right?
But I think about that with, some of the more significant forms of partnering among the institutions, where if the word gets out too early at the institutions themselves, that can be the very thing that tanks the potential. Like if the right groundwork hasn't been laid.
And totally. And I think, listen, the degree of difficulty is very high because I guess there's a hospital town and there's a factory town, but there's not a normal nonprofit town. You know, you don't hear about like it's a United Way town, or it's a Children's Aid town, or, you know, it's a Wounded Warrior town. You know, colleges are different. I mean, and I'm more likely to find out where you went to college, regardless of where you went to college, when we meet, than I am to find out, I don't know, where you worked 5 years ago. I mean, there's a lot of sort of emotion.
And identity. I mean, it's an
Identity. So you know, so the communication challenge is real. Like I don't think there's always an easy answer. I mean, I do think that and there's something on our website. I think some of these discussions do raise ethical issues, and, you know, it's kind of nice if leaders have approached things in a way that they don't need to lie. So, you know, one way to not be forced to answer the question, are we in trouble and are you considering a merger? It's nice to be able to answer that by saying no. And, you know, we're exploring lots of things. I mean, one of the reasons to start early in these things is that the communication, I think, gets a little bit easier, not easy. But my main point is, word may leak out about these things, and the communication challenges may be hard, but it can't be from us, right? Like it can't be from us. So I think we're pretty careful about that. You know, I come out of a finance background, and there are lots of bad things about that, and there are lots of good things about that. But one good thing, I think, that most people learn in finance is how to keep secrets. I don't know, you know, there's some legal infrastructure behind that. And that's a good habit to have. And we have that sort of culture, you know, that culture at SeaChange.
And it really is what it means to be caring for the client and their, right. I mean, that makes perfect sense.
And so then on the bevy of, I think the word was bevy.
I like the word bevy. The gaggle.
Gaggle.
Electric.
I think what isn't for one set of animal, it's a murder of foxes or something. Anyway, there's all sorts of strange words for a collection. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
It's an open question. Again, I think outside of higher education, it's just a very, very disorganized or unorganized market of what outside of higher education are called technical assistance providers. And so, you know, we've been active sort of trying to organize that market a little bit, and even through this collaborative that we're involved with, the Sustained Collaboration Network, to support and financially support some training institutes. So we're not only organizing the market of technical assistance providers, we're trying to help grow it.
Right.
You know, it's possible that in higher education that's not as valuable, because it is a pretty small community, and many people already know one another. And the institutions, although the biggest social service institutions are certainly as large as many colleges, most colleges are not so small that they can't go through the process of issuing their own RFPs, and particularly in the public system, there are procurement rules. So, you know, I don't know. It's early stages. The main thing is that we want to make sure that institutions think hard about what they need from third parties, and consider a range of third parties, and pick the one that they feel is the best for them. And then we're interested in why they think it's the best for them. I mean, and my joke is, you know, if we talk to only one consultant and we really think he's the best, and he happens to be my husband, I think we'd say, like, maybe you could talk to a few others. So, you know, I think we want to make sure that there's a process that's been gone through. But to what degree our network, which is what we're calling it, is helpful in that, I don't know. You know, we've basically said, if you'd like to be considered for referrals when we think they are appropriate and the institutions ask, please fill in this sort of short listing of your qualifications. Just basically tell us, you know, what have you done and how do you approach the work, and where do you want referrals? It's not more simple. It's not simple any more than that.
I'll be sure.
But whether that turns out to be helpful in the way it has outside of higher education, I think it's early days.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to put that link in the show notes so folks can find it and perhaps expand that network even more. So last question, I'm looking at the time, which is just why does all of this matter to you? So I know you're a small house. You're investing a lot of time in this. You have made this decision to open up, to move from the nonprofits in general to the eds. What makes your heart sing about this?
Well, the dry answer is that it's on mission for us, that our mission is to support not-for-profits facing complex financial and organizational challenges, and that many higher education institutions are not-for-profits. So, like, why wouldn't it be on mission? And there's, I mean, if that wasn't our mission, that allows us to do this, but it doesn't describe why.
And it was your mission before you decided to do this.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's the origin story very quickly, and it probably took all these things. Bill Bowen, about 6 years ago before he died, and I think Bill's books on higher education are the best books. And Truth in Advertising, he was the president for 2 of my 4 years at Princeton, but I didn't know him then. But I think he's a unique talent. He said, you should get into higher education. You could be helpful. A storm is coming. And then he gave me a lecture on demographics and technology and politics. So I think that we needed that first. If it hadn't been that conversation in his office that fall day, we wouldn't be here. Then I think second was that we got drawn into it because people started to call, and we made a few grants. And then the third is because we think it matters for students. I mean, I come from a family of academics, so I'm sympathetic to faculty. I'm sympathetic to college towns. I'm sympathetic to alumni and nostalgia. Like, there's a lot of things that I'm sympathetic to, but that's not enough for us. We really believe that in this country, particularly, students, particularly BIPOC or students from low-income backgrounds or first-generation college goers, are told, work hard, go to college, and it's the best single thing you can do for yourself. And to if we can help institutions make good or make better, if that's a word, on that promise, and reduce the likelihood that students don't get the benefit of that bargain, that is really the thing that's going on here. And then the final thing is just, SeaChange is personally attracted to high degree of difficulty undertakings. And I think, with the possible exception of some work we've done around merging synagogues, this is, it's a very high degree of difficulty. And so I think it allows us, to learn and that's, that's part of what gets you up in the morning.
Thank you. Well, I know you said the fund itself is not what's transformational, it's the partnerships that it's enabling, but for what it's worth, I think the fund is also transformational.
Well, what I would say is, icing and cake. Last thing I'd say is, I do hope on a second order basis, we can be part of, I don't know, decriminalizing or normalizing the conversation. I mean, most if you believe the pundits, and I'm not saying I believe this, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, that the most at risk schools are the smaller privates. The vast majority of those schools were started between 1820 and 1880. And if you just step back and say, like, wow, to have gotten to this point, to be almost 200 years old, or 150, 200 years, look at corporates, look at other sort of not-for-profit institutions, like to kind of reframe this whole discussion, whether it's back office sharing or merging, as not a sign of failure, the scarlet letter, but more a natural student-centric evolution. That, like, of course you're sharing your back office. Why wouldn't you? That's just what people do. Like, of course you're becoming an institute at a larger public, because that's the way to take your, just sort of to try to get that conversation a little bit more regularized, because stigma holds people back from making good decisions. And I don't see why this should be stigmatized in the way perhaps it has been. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, John, thank you so much. I look forward to our paths crossing again soon. And for those who are interested in downloading Myco's 20-page collaboration guide, please swing by the website. Thank you. See you soon.
Okay. Bye.